In the summer of 1854, Dr. Charles Whitaker, a pioneering British doctor renowned for his controversial research, led an expedition into the heart of the Amazon rainforest. His team sought to uncover new medical possibilities, but what they found in a remote indigenous village would push the boundaries of their understanding and their morality. The expedition was initiated by one of Dr. Whitaker's assistants, who had stumbled upon rumors of an undiscovered village untouched by the modern world. Instead of celebrating this unprecedented discovery, Dr. Whitaker saw it as an opportunity to test a new compound he had developed. For decades, whispers of their unethical experiments circulated among the locals, but it wasn't until Dr. Whitaker's death in 1891 that the grisly details emerged. What happened 120 years later, when a group of modern researchers arrived at the same village, was even more horrifying, leaving many to believe the area should be left undisturbed. This is Dr. Whitaker's story, transcribed to present-day English, just days before his demise. As we approached the village, the dense canopy of the rainforest opened up to reveal humble thatched huts surrounded by lush greenery. The air was thick with humidity, and the distant calls of exotic birds added to the sense of isolation. Despite the beauty, an uneasiness settled over me, a feeling I couldn't shake. I had ventured into countless remote regions in my career, but this village felt unsettlingly unique, as if its very isolation harbored secrets too dark for the outside world. I told my team to set up camp on the outskirts, close enough to the village for our work, but far enough to avoid unwanted attention. We planned to begin our studies at first light. On the first morning, as the sun rose over the treetops, we were greeted by a young villager who led us to their healer, a woman named Mama Kura. She was wary of us, but agreed to show us their medicinal practices. I observed with feigned interest, my mind preoccupied with the experiments I intended to conduct. That night, after the villagers had retired, I gathered my team members, Dr. Edwards and Dr. Harper, to add our compound to the village water supply. We waited, observing from a distance, but saw no immediate effect. Frustrated, I decided to test a concentrated dose on a young man named Tupa. He was unconscious, having been given a potent sedative earlier in the evening. As I injected Tupa with the compound, his body began to convulse violently. His limbs twisted grotesquely, bending at impossible angles, and a guttural scream escaped his lips. I felt a chill run down my spine as he thrashed against the restraints, his body contorting in unnatural ways. "Hold him down," I shouted, my voice trembling. But it was too late. Tupa's body went limp, and a deathly silence filled the air. We stared at each other in shock, realizing the gravity of what we had done. Around Tupa's neck was a pendant with a brilliant red stone, which seemed to pulse with an eerie light. I pocketed the pendant, and we quickly buried Tupa's body deep in the jungle, swearing each other to secrecy. But the next morning, the villagers knew something was amiss. They could feel the absence of one of their own. Mama Kura confronted us, her eyes filled with suspicion. We lied, saying he had run off into the jungle, but I could tell she didn't believe us. Over the next few days, more villagers began to fall ill. They showed symptoms similar to Tupa's convulsions, and one by one, they died in agony. Since they had ingested the compound through the village water supply, their deaths were slower but no less horrifying. I noticed that every villager wore the same type of pendant Tupa had, each with a red stone. One evening, as the villagers gathered in their temple, I observed them praying fiercely. In the center of the temple stood a large idol, made of the same red stone as the pendants. As the villagers chanted and prayed, the stone began to glow with an intense, otherworldly light. The sight sent a shiver down my spine. That night, I was awakened by a soft whisper. "Dr. Whitaker," it called, chilling me to the bone. I followed the voice into the jungle, my lantern casting eerie shadows on the trees. It led me to the spot where we had buried Tupa. His grave was open, and only half of his body lay at the bottom of the hole. A trail of blood led away from his grave into the forest. I heard the sounds of something being dragged. As I moved the tall grass to see who it was, I froze. It was Tupa, alive, using his arms to drag only the upper half of his body. Terrified, I tried to quietly move in the opposite direction, but I made a sound, and Tupa stopped. He turned around to face me, his eyes glowing like the red stones. A guttural scream escaped his mouth, and a gust of wind threw me high up, crashing me against a tree branch. When I woke up, I ran for my life back to camp, my heart pounding in my chest. We left the village at dawn. The haunting image of Tupa burned into my memory. I knew we had unleashed something beyond our understanding, something that would never let us rest. As we packed our equipment, the true horror began. The villagers who had died started to reanimate. Their upper halves started to tear and crawl towards the temple, leaving trails of blood behind them. Mama Kura and the surviving villagers were chanting louder now, their prayers filled with desperation. The large red stone in the temple glowed brighter, casting an eerie red light across the village. We watched in horror as the dead villagers reached the temple, their half-bodies convulsing in unnatural ways. The ground seemed to tremble as the red light pulsed in time with their chants. It was as if the very soul of the village was crying out in agony. In absolute shock and fear, my team and I fled the Amazon village, the haunting image of the crawling dead and the glowing red stone etched into our minds. We knew we had awakened something ancient and malevolent, something that would haunt us for the rest of our days. After his return to civilization, Dr. Whitaker lived out his days in a state of paranoia and fear. He died mysteriously and alone, his body discovered in his study clutching a red stone pendant. This stone, later acquired by a museum, became a curious artifact in their collection, its origins and significance unknown to all but a few. Over the next century, the story of Dr. Whitaker's expedition faded into obscurity, relegated to the realm of myth and local legend. In 1974, a young and ambitious anthropologist, Dr. Michael Lawson, became fascinated by the tales of this lost village which he called the Crimson Jungle, inspired by the eerie red stones that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. Driven by a desire for fame and recognition, he set out to uncover its secrets, believing that he could succeed where Dr. Whitaker had failed. However, the journey to the Crimson Jungle would cost him everything. He was the only person to survive. Shockingly, he confessed to killing his entire team and his wife. He was sentenced to life in prison, and only after 2 years did he agree to tell the world about the horrifying terror that he and his friends experienced. This is a summary of Dr. Lawson's account of what transpired during their ill-fated expedition to the Crimson Jungle, given from his prison cell. I was once a respected anthropologist, known for my daring expeditions, but my career had stagnated. I needed something big to revive it, and when I heard about the lost Amazon village discovered by Dr. Whitaker, I knew this was it. I hired an indigenous guide named Javier, a man who knew the jungle like the back of his hand. He warned me about the dangers and spoke of curses, but I didn't listen. I was too hungry for success. I even brought my wife Rebecca along, thinking it would be a grand adventure for us. As we approached the village, the jungle seemed to close in around us, the thick canopy blocking out the sun. We finally reached the abandoned huts, eerie and silent. Scattered among them were the upper halves of skeletons, bones bleached by time. My crew was scared, but all I could think about was how famous I was going to become. Javier, our guide, begged me to leave. He said the place was cursed, that we were disturbing something ancient and evil. But I couldn't let him derail my plans. So when he tried to leave, I shot him in the leg. I tricked everyone into believing it was an accident. Even Javier believed me, believed my apology. We set up camp by a stream, unaware that the water was still tainted by the compound Dr. Whitaker had introduced over a century ago. At first, everything seemed fine. We explored the village, documenting the huts and the eerie remains. Tom, our TV producer, was excited to capture everything on camera. But when he filmed the temple, something bizarre happened. We spotted the holy stone in the center of the temple. There was a deep chasm around the altar, and no way for us to get there. So Tom started to zoom in to the holy stone with his camera. He was mesmerized with its beauty and was transfixed by its glow. But all I could see was a rock, and it wasn't glowing. I wanted to leave the temple as I started hearing strange rumbles, but Tom was excited like a child. So I left, but as soon as I came outside, I heard Tom scream in pain. I ran back in with the other guards, and we were all shocked to see Tom's eyes were charred to a crisp. Despite that, I refused to leave. While Tom was unconscious, I convinced everyone that his camera had short-circuited and there was no reason to leave the village. As days passed, the sense of dread grew. Crew members started disappearing. First, it was Lisa, one of our researchers. We found her the next morning, hanging from a tree, her neck twisted at an impossible angle. It looked like an accident, but deep down, we all knew it was the village. Then Jack, our sound technician, vanished. We heard his screams echo through the jungle, but couldn't find him. His body, we later discovered, mangled and broken, as if some unseen force had torn him apart. It looked like it had rained blood in the forest. I kept telling the crew these were accidents, urging them to press on in memory of those we'd lost. But in truth, I was terrified. The next night I woke up and Rebecca was not beside me. We all looked for her, but she was nowhere to be found. Javier used his torch and found her footprints leading to the temple. When we reached the temple, Rebecca was standing right beside the stone that was glowing at the altar. How she got there past the chasm was a mystery. I tried and tried to cross the deep chasm, but none of us could. I shouted and cried, but she was in a trance, staring at the stone as the glow of the stone grew brighter, blinding us all. Rebecca started screaming in pain. Her body convulsed violently, her skin bubbling and melting away. Flesh slowed off her bones as she screamed in agony. I watched, helpless and horrified, as she died right in front of my eyes. As we all started to run away from the temple, I saw the skeletons, bones long since dried, come to life. Their upper halves crawled towards the temple, driven by some unseen force. I ran and ran till I collapsed, far away from the village. When I looked back, I was lost. Every direction I looked seemed unknown, unfamiliar. I only followed the sun and kept moving east. In the end, I was the only one who made it out alive. Dr. Lawson's confession shocked the world. His once promising career was reduced to a cautionary tale, his life consumed by regret and horror. The red stone pendants and other artifacts from the Crimson Jungle were sealed away, their secrets hidden from public view. In prison, Dr. Lawson rarely spoke of his time in the jungle. When he did, his voice dropped to a whisper, and his eyes became distant and haunted. "Stay away from the island," he would say, his words heavy with regret. Please like and subscribe for more horror, scary stories.